The focus of this video is going to be checking the condition and the level of fluids in a vehicle. Very critical step, whether you're the owner of the vehicle or whether you are the technician working on the vehicle, to ensure the longest possible life of components in the vehicle as well as the best operation of those components. And we're going to start with engine oil because that is the number one fluid that needs to be checked regularly in a vehicle, especially a vehicle with a lot of miles on it. And it should be checked for both the condition as well as making sure the proper oil level is being maintained. Now, oil level is checked using a dipstick. This vehicle has a unique situation in that the oil dipstick and the filler neck, or the filler cap, are actually combined together. Most vehicles you will find that the oil dipstick is separate from the filler cap. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to remove the filler cap and dipstick combination from our vehicle. And one of the things that we'll find is that the oil is kind of all over that dipstick. So to get a true reading, the first thing that we want to do is wipe the oil off that dipstick and then reinstall that. Anytime you're reading a dipstick, it's necessary to do that. Reinstall our dipstick and remove it again, and now we can accurately read the engine oil level. When we read our engine oil level, we'll see that the highest circle that we see on our dipstick represents the maximum fill level. We're most certainly not at the maximum level. We're also not at the absolute minimum either. If we were to go down to about here, I know you can't see it because of the oil on the dipstick, there's a line that indicates that we are low by approximately 1 quart. We're about halfway between there, which would tell me that this vehicle is down about a half a quart of oil. But another thing that we want to know is the condition of that oil. You can see that the oil has a very dark color to it. We should be able to see some light through this oil. That indicates that this oil is pretty dirty and really needs to be replaced pretty soon. So knowing that, I'm not even going to worry about adding that half a quart of oil. This vehicle is due for an oil change and the oil really needs to be replaced in it rather than just being topped off. We'll wipe that oil. In a case where we're going to replace the oil in a vehicle or we're even going to top off the oil level, we always want to use the correct specified oil for that engine. This engine calls for 5W30 oil, so we want to make sure that that's what you're using, as well as taking a look at the owner's manual or the service manual for that vehicle and making sure we're using the correct oil. Now, when we talk about viscosity of an oil, what we're talking about is really the thickness of the oil, or the more technical term is the resistance of that oil to flow. In the old days, manufacturers built engines with very loose clearances between parts, and they used very thick oils. Over time, what they've realized is that engines last longer with tighter clearances, tighter spaces between parts, and thinner oils that can flow better. By being able to flow better, that oil can get to the parts more efficiently, and it can do its job more efficiently. So we've started using oils, again, that are much lighter weight, lower viscosity oils, and therefore able to flow better and reach the engine parts better. As oil increases in temperature, its viscosity also decreases. That's why when we see the weighting on the oil, in this case 5W30, it accounts for that, because as that oil gets hot, its viscosity is going to decrease and it's going to flow better. But we need that oil to also be able to flow properly when we first start the engine, when the engine is cold. Again, always refer to the service manual or the owner's manual and make sure you're using the right oil that's manufactured for the vehicle that you're working on. The next fluid that we're going to focus on is brake fluid. Now, brake fluid is also an important component in the vehicle, and I want to point something out about brake fluid. Brake fluid in a vehicle should never be low. If that brake fluid is low, it indicates that there's another problem. That vehicle should not be driven until you can find the reason why that brake fluid is low. There is a leak somewhere in that system causing that brake fluid to be low, and it is going to lead to a brake failure at some point. Do not continue to drive a vehicle with low brake fluid unless you have determined the cause of that low brake fluid. It's difficult to see on the camera, but this vehicle has two indications for brake fluid. It has a minimum and a maximum level. The maximum level is right around here, and we can see through the container that the brake fluid is just below the maximum level. This vehicle has plenty of brake fluid. Now, if we needed to add brake fluid, and again, the only time we should be adding brake fluid is either when we're doing a brake system flush or when we've installed a new component in the brake system and we're having to do a system bleeding where we remove the air from the system. We do want to make sure that, just like with engine oil, that we use the correct fluid for that vehicle. This vehicle specifies that we use DOT or DOT3 brake fluid. That's the only fluid that we want to use in this vehicle. Using a different brake fluid can cause the seals in the system to basically deteriorate, and it can cause leaks in the system. Again, the only time we should be adding brake fluid is when we are doing a brake system flush or we're bleeding air out of the system. If at any other time we have low brake fluid on that vehicle, there's another problem going on, and we need to address that other problem first. The next system that we're going to talk about is the radiator. Now, when we check coolant level in a vehicle, we never, ever open a radiator cap, a pressure cap, on a hot vehicle. We want to first make sure that we allow that vehicle to cool off properly. I would say a good minimum would be about 1 hour. But the system should be fairly cool to the touch. And even then, when we remove that cap, we want to make sure we do so in the proper manner. The first step is to turn the cap one click, which basically will relieve any pressure from that system and allow that cap. You'll see I can now wiggle that cap around. I've now safely removed the pressure from that system. I can then push down on the cap and remove the cap the remainder of the way from the top of the radiator. Just to note, when you look at a pressure cap, one of the things that's usually indicated on the pressure cap is the type of fluid that's needed, in this case Dexcool. I know it's a little blurry on the camera, as well as the pressure of the cap. We want to make sure that we're using the correct pressure cap. The reason the correct pressure cap is needed is because the pressure in the system actually prevents the water from boiling. Every pound of pressure in that system increases the boiling point by 3 degrees Fahrenheit. So a 15-pound pressure cap will increase the boiling point of the coolant by 45 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you remember, water normally boils at 212 degrees. We've now bumped that up by an additional 45 degrees by keeping it under that 15 pounds per square inch. In addition to that, antifreeze also increases the boiling point of that water and, more importantly, decreases the freezing point of that water. Another thing that's important to note, most cooling systems use a mix of 50% water, 50% antifreeze. The water is what actually does the cooling. The water is what actually pulls the heat away from the engine. Antifreeze is not very efficient at doing that. The job of the antifreeze is to keep the water from freezing and help prevent it from boiling, not to pull heat away. So you are not doing your vehicle a favor. If it calls for a 50-50 mix of water and antifreeze, you're not doing your vehicle a favor by saying, oh, I'm going to go 75% antifreeze or 100% antifreeze. Unless, now again, there are systems out there that use antifreeze that is not designed to be mixed with water. You need to know what you're using. This vehicle, for example, uses Dexcool, as we mentioned. Dexcool is a General Motors specific antifreeze. It's orange in color and very different from the green antifreeze that we're used to seeing. If you mix antifreeze and water, the two types of antifreeze together, antifreeze and water are always mixed. If you mix those two types of antifreeze together, what will happen in that case is they will basically form a gel. So it is important to make sure you're using the correct antifreeze. Another note about antifreeze. Antifreeze is toxic. It can be dangerous for pets. And because it has a sweet smell to it, it tends to attract pets. So we don't want to leave antifreeze around where pets can get to it. Now, if we find that our antifreeze is dirty and not clear in color, we need to occasionally do a flush of our cooling system. When we do a flush of the system, what we basically do is clear the fluid out. We run fresh water through the system to clean it, and then we refill with a fresh 50-50 mix, if that's what the vehicle calls for, of antifreeze and water. Now, it may be a little difficult to see, but this system actually is a little bit low on coolant. You can see it's several inches down below the radiator cap. Really, it should be about 1 inch below. So we would want to add some antifreeze and water mix. Again, this vehicle calls for a 50-50 mix. So we would want to add antifreeze and water to this system. When we do reinstall our radiator cap, we want to go ahead and install that the same way, opposite I guess of the way we removed it. One click and then a second click. And this cap actually has an arrow on it that if the cap's installed properly, that arrow will actually point at our overflow hose. Our overflow hose takes us over to a tank on the other side. Again, remember, coolant expands as it gets hot. And once we reach that maximum 15 pounds per square inch, the excess coolant needs somewhere to go. And as it's relieved by the cap, it will flow over to our overflow tank. The next fluid that we're going to check is going to be power steering fluid. Power steering fluid is one of probably the most overlooked fluids in a vehicle. It is important that we inspect power steering fluid both for its condition as well as fluid level. If we allow power steering fluid to get low, it can damage the power steering pump, it can damage the steering rack, and other internal components. It can be a very costly repair that we can avoid just by simply making sure that we check the power steering fluid level. Now, I want to note power steering fluid level gets checked with the vehicle running and on a flat level surface. Anytime we're starting a vehicle, we want to make sure that we're following proper safety procedures for starting that vehicle. One of those rules being that there should not be anybody standing in front of or behind the vehicle when the vehicle is started. We also want to make sure that no one is leaning into the engine compartment when we are starting that vehicle. We want to make sure that we're clear prior to starting that, and then we can safely start the vehicle and check our fluid level. So this is a standard shift vehicle. Most of the vehicles you'll be starting in here will be automatics. If it's an automatic transmission, we can make sure the vehicle's in park and before starting it. With a standard shift transmission, we want to have the shifter in neutral, the parking brake is set. We're going to depress our clutch pedal, and we'll go ahead and start the vehicle. Once the vehicle's running, we can safely do our checks of the power steering fluid level. Okay, once the vehicle's running, we can go ahead and check our power steering fluid. We want to make sure that we keep our hands free of the drive belt. Obviously, any loose clothing can get caught in that belt. We're going to go ahead and remove our power steering fluid dipstick. And just like with the engine oil, we want to make sure we wipe off our dipstick, place it back in. And then when we remove it, we can look at our level. Now remember, power steering fluid, just like automatic transmission fluid, just like coolant, expands when it gets hot. So even though we're at the lowest reading right now, this power steering level is fine. If this fluid was hot, I would expect to see it up a little bit higher on the dipstick. But for being cold, it's totally fine. To check the condition, we want to take a clean rag and just wipe some of that fluid onto the rag. And you can see, if we look at what came off on the rag, that the fluid is fairly clear. It could have a reddish color to it. That doesn't really matter. As long as it's not dirty looking, we don't have to worry about the fluid. So the condition of the power steering fluid in this case is totally fine. The last fluid that I want to check is our washer fluid. This vehicle happens to be very low on washer fluid. I just want to point out one thing about washer fluid. Even though it's not a critical fluid for the vehicle to operate, we want to make sure that we are not ever putting water in this system. Water will freeze and it will destroy the washer system. Make sure that you use proper washer fluid, which is basically alcohol. All right, that alcohol will not freeze, and it will also clean the window a lot better. So we want to make sure that we're using the right stuff. Okay, so that takes you through the proper checks of fluids on a vehicle. There are other fluids that need to be accessed from underneath. We'll talk about that a little bit using sight holes for checking fluids. But these are the basic fluids that anyone can check on their own vehicle from the top of the vehicle, from the engine compartment.